Let's be very clear about something. The church, Christianity, is not under the so-called New Covenant or New Testament today. Just read the context of Jeremiah 31:31, where the Bible, the Tanakh, first introduces the concept of the Berith Kadashah, the so-called New Covenant or New Testament, which is probably better interpreted as the renewed covenant, and you will see that it does not refer to the dispensation of today, but rather it refers to the latter days dispensation. Sometime around 1996 or 1997, I think it was like the 55th or 56th conference of ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society, my former professors, Dr. John R. Master and Dr. Brian G. Taves, they gave a very controversial discussion, a lecture on the so-called New Covenant and how the truth is the church is not under it today. These two highly respected biblical academic scholars were basically harassed, humiliated for simply looking at what the Bible actually says and trying to teach the truth. I was an undergraduate at the time at Philadelphia Biblical University, today known as Cairn University, and I took my Doctrine 1 and 2 courses with Dr. John R. Master, as well as an Ezra and Nehemiah course with Dr. Brian G. Taves. Now, Dr. Master and Dr. Taves claimed that the so-called New Testament doesn't actually state that we are under the so-called New Covenant at all, and I tend to agree with their opinion. So where did this idea that we are under the New Covenant arise from? And I think several places. One is Hebrews 8:6, which states that Jesus is the mediator of a new covenant, which is established upon better promises. The Greek word here is nomotheteo, and it appears earlier in Hebrews 7:11, where it is probably better translated as the Israelites received the law from the priesthood, the Levites. So the Greek word nomotheteo has more to do with receiving the law through teaching, instruction, rather than legislation, actual enactment of the so-called New Covenant. So essentially, the teaching of the Epistle to Hebrews is simply stating that under Jesus, this New Covenant was taught with better promises, not that it was ever actually enacted. For example, the Gospel of Matthew 26:28 states that this cup of wine was allegedly the blood of the New Covenant or the New Testament. But later on, Jesus specifically states that he was taking a Nazirite vow where he would not partake of this cup of wine again until he did so with his church in his Father's kingdom. Again, mentioning a latter days scenario, not the church age today. Lastly, of course, we might mention 2 Corinthians 4:6, which states that we are ministers of this New Covenant or New Testament. And the Greek word there is diakonos, which means a deacon, or it could also refer to a deaconess, which would probably be translated into Hebrew as shamashim, and which would today be interpreted as the gabayin, the servants of the synagogue. Therefore, I think that this is probably the best way to interpret this teaching of the so-called New Covenant or New Testament, the Berith Kadashah, in the Greek Bible, the Christian Bible. Nonetheless, my former professors, Dr. Master and Dr. Taves, were harassed, and they seem to have even been forbidden to ever talk about this topic again, because I asked both of them about it. I asked Dr. Master in my Doctrine 1 and Doctrine 2 classes about it, and he just changed the topic. And I did the same with Dr. Taves in my Ezra and Nehemiah class, where he just simply changed the topic. And in fact, even the lecture that they gave, all the hard copies seem to have been hidden by the librarian at Philadelphia Biblical University's Maslin Learning Resource Center. For a while, I had a photocopy of its basic outlines, but I was unable to actually even recover a copy of the actual lecture. I think this is a shame and a disgrace, and just shows how highly deceptive Christianity is today in order to try and teach their false, unbiblical doctrines. Of course, I believe that Christianity is the great apostasy from Judaism, the great whore of Babylon mentioned in Revelation chapter 17. Indeed, why was John the Revelator simply astonished about this revelation regarding the harlot Babylon the Great, and where he had to be actually rebuked by the angels, because this was Christianity. This was his faith, the church, which had become corrupted, apostate by the latter days. I'm Stephanie Michelle. Shalom. Peace. Postscript. Hebrews 9:15 mentions that Jesus has become the mediator of this so-called New Covenant or New Testament, this Brit Chadashah, this renewed covenant, based upon the fact that he is a symbol of the red heifer offering, which I consider to be, of course, the baptism for the dead, baptism from the impurity of coming into contact with dead bodies. That is according to 1 Corinthians 15:29. Indeed, Hebrews 4:2 mentions that the disciples of Jesus heard the same gospel message that the Israelites did when they came out of Egypt with Moses. This happens after Exodus 20:18, where it states that the Israelites had a vision of synesthesia, a mixing of the senses, where they saw the thunder and heard the lightning. In Exodus 20:19, it states that the Israelites, after God began to share this gospel message, they said to God, "We don't want to hear you, we'll only listen to Moses." This is a concept that the Mormonite prophet Joseph Smith Jr. referred to. Galatians 3:24 states that because of the sin of the Israelites, the law of Moses, the Torah HaMoshe, was given to them as a pedagogos, a school teacher, where it goes on to state in Galatians 4:25 that once faith has come, then this pedagogos, this school teacher, is no longer needed. Indeed, Galatians 3:19 mentions that this Torah HaMoshe, this law of Moses, was added by a mediator, probably meaning Moshe Hanavi, Moses the prophet himself, due to transgression or sin. This does not, however, mean that the law of Moses is abolished, but rather that it is fulfilled in Mashiach, Messiah. Galatians 5:3 makes very clear that anybody who is circumcised as a Jew is a debtor to keep the entire 613 mitzvot or commandments of the law of Moses, whereas Gentiles who are not circumcised are not obligated to fulfill anything but the 7 Noahide laws. These 7 Noahide laws being explicated in the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, in Tractate Sanhedrin 56a, 59a, and 105a. These 7 Noahide laws being intimated in the book of Acts 15:20. Indeed, the Gospel of Matthew, the most Jewish of the 3 synoptic Gospels, in 5:17 through 18, states that Jesus did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill it. Where he also mentions the eschatological nature of the Torah HaMoshe, the law of Moses, where he mentions that not one jot or tittle, not one yod or togging from the law of Moses shall pass away until the heavens and the earth pass away, indicating a time after the eschatological kingdom of Hamashiach, the Messiah, where the renewed heavens and the renewed earth are implemented by God, which again I think is the actual reference to the Brit Chadashah, the renewed covenant mentioned in Jeremiah 31:31. This is evident in the book of Malachi, which in the Christian Bible ends the so-called Old Testament before the New Testament begins with the Gospel of Matthew. However, in the Hebrew Bible, the Bible actually ends with the book of Chronicles. In the Hebrew Bible, this is Malachi 3, 22, 23, and 24. However, in the Christian Bible, this is Malachi 4, 4, 5, and 6. It states, "Behold, in the latter days, God is going to send Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet," and it actually admonishes the believers to remember the Torah HaMoshe, the law of Moses. Not the law of Christ, because the law of Moses has allegedly been abolished. Furthermore, it specifically references the Chukim V'Mishpatim, the statutes and the judgments of the Torah HaMoshe, the law of Moses. So this includes all of the 613 mitzvot, the commandments of the law of Moses, and not just some spiritual law behind the law of Moses that was allegedly brought into the law of Christ. And 20 Christians who claim that we cannot listen to the Pharisees' interpretation of the law of Moses, remember that the Gospel of Matthew 23, 2-3 has Jesus exhorting his disciples to listen to the Pharisees because they sit in the Kiseh Moshe, the seat of Moses. Indeed, the Pharisees were not guilty of so-called legalism, but rather hypocrisy. Jesus specifically condemns them for telling you to observe the law of Moses, but then they are hypocrites who do not observe the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 17:11 is the justification for the so-called oral Torah, the Mishnah, where the Bible states that if you have a question about the law of Moses, you are to go to the judge in Jerusalem, and then you are to listen to his judgment of HaTorah, the law, and you're not to stray to the left or to the right of it.